All right, well, I'm happy to introduce Yuan. She's an assistant professor of psychology and neuroscience here at Boulder. She's also an affiliate in the computer science department, so students who are interested in these topics are certainly welcome to talk to her about research. So she leads the development, education, and learning researches at the intersection of human cognition, development, education, and machine learning. She got her PhD from Northwestern and then was a postdoc at Indiana before Boulder. Anyway, should be an exciting talk. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So for folks over Zoom, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm not seeing. You think so? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. You pretty much covered. I was gonna do a self introduction. Let's see. Let's see. Let me get out. And I'll say, okay, got it. Ugh. All right. Now I'm gonna start sharing. So, my name is Yuan. I'm assistant professor from psychology. I lead the DEL lab, development, education, and learning. So my goal today is to tell you guys about my research program. Hopefully we'll start some interesting discussions. Feel free to interrupt me anytime you have questions during my talk. We don't have to cover everything. I'm gonna try to stop at 45 minutes sharp, so we'll be having plenty times for Q&A, okay? All right, so I'm gonna start my talk with large language models. Just kidding, yeah. I'm not gonna start by talking about ChatGPT. That joke cracked me up every time. I'm gonna start by talking about, you can say, precursors of large language models. So latent semantic analyses, which is proposed over 20 years ago. And when Landauer and colleagues proposed OSA, they think this is beyond engineering trick, right? They think they're solving the Plato's problem, which is the acquisition, induction, and representation of knowledge. So from the get-go, large language models have a more ambitious goal, right? It's about the representation of human knowledge and its origin. It might be hard to see, but this paper is actually published in Psychological Review, which is a top journal for theories and computational models of human cognition. In fact, the history of AI and the history of cognitive development and the modeling of cognitive development has been intertwined throughout history. For instance, when Rumenhar, Hinton, McClellan and colleagues first popularized the PDP model, they try to use this model to explain a lot of phenomena in human cognition. And one interesting example is to use a simple associative network to explain the acquisition of past tense, the ED form in English language. How do children learn that regularity, right? We know children can learn the regular verbs before the irregular ones, but it's not just clear stage like you transition from one stage to another stage, it's more gradual transition. So similarly, when Jeff Allman proposed a simple recurrent network, he also had that in mind, trying to explain language acquisition, how lexical categories might emerge over time by discovering statistical regularities in the linguistic input. Okay. So the parallel between babies and robots makes sense because the core issue in artificial intelligence is about how do you design a system where you can take a finite set of input data, learn from that data, but then generalize to an infinite set of situations, okay? So what do you think is the goal of biological intelligence? Yeah, it's exactly the same, right? It's about whether it's in informal settings or formal classroom. When we teach undergrad, the hope is we can show them a couple examples and they learn the latent structure, the principles from those examples, and then generalize to new situations, right? So there's this parallel. And my research program is very much motivated by these questions. So my background is from cognitive development. So I'll tell you guys a lot of research from that perspective, but I'm also going to tell you how we use machine learning both as a statistical tool to extract patterns in empirical data and also as a series of models for human cognition. In particular, I'm going to show you 3 areas of my research program that basically study the interaction among these different components. So in the first area, I'll show you how we use eye tracking to investigate how systematic language might lead to systematic attention in young children. Then I'll show you how the acquisition of a system of language might help to bootstrap the acquisition of system of conceptual knowledge using data analytics methods such as decision tree or network analyses. And finally, I'll attempt to put all of this together, so use deep learning models to try to see how we can get from system of linguistic input to system of knowledge via changing learners' attention using deep learning models such as image captioning and reinforcement learning models. Okay, all right, so let's start with the first one, how language leads to attention. I'm going to start by saying that a perception and attention actually start out as highly disorganized and fragile. William James has this famous quote in which he described the world of infants as this great blooming, buzzing confusion. You have information coming from all of this different sensory input. How do you make sense of that? Initially, maybe highly disorganized. When a naive learner is presented with similar situation where you have to learn a new interface, a new thing, your attention and perception may be characterized by the same sort of confusion. This is image from egocentric view of a participant in one of our study. In this study, the grad students, Turin from Atlas is interested in learning about how do adults learn to play piano using different notational systems. Even after 80 trials, this person is still like trying to figure out how does the mapping actually work? What is structure in the notational system? What is structure on the piano board? Okay. So the core problem is the stimulus from the external environment is largely continuous. So what we do is we use language or other symbolic representations to create categories and structures. So one famous example is from the color domain. So when you think about a color, the color spectrum is continuous, right? From one to the other side, represented horizontally here. Vertically, we're representing the brightness of the color. So you can think of red as a brighter pink, right? So what is showing on top is in English, how the color words mapped onto the physical stimulus, right? That we carve the continuous representation of nature into discrete categories. Yeah, and the bottom is from another language, another culture, and you can see that culture conceptualized colors in quite different ways, right? So for some color we might call green in English would call it something akin to yellow in that culture. Yep. Okay, so another example is from space. I don't know about you, I hate parking at DIA. This is me every time, right? Going to the parking lot. Apologize for the quality of the image. So remembering spatial location is another case where we have to recruit some kind of categorical representation, right? So I try to remember the name of the level, the rabbit level, the fish level, and they conveniently label all of the rows for you, row A1, B1, and so on. And I'm sure some of you might be super spatializers. You might encode your parking location as the northeast corner, right? All of those are language tricks that we use, right, to represent continuous stimulus space. So in one of our projects, we look at how children encode spatial relationship between different components. And to put you in the shoes of our participants, I'm going to give you a demo. So on the next slide, you'll see a figure at the center. I want you to pay attention, try your best to remember it because it's going to disappear very quickly. And then there's going to be a delay, and then I will test your memory. Okay? Questions about the procedure? We're all good? You ready? Okay. just delay, you don't need to do anything. Which one did you see? How many people think it's the one on the left? Oh, yeah, we got 2, 3. And how many people think it went on the right? Oh, a little bit more. You guys on the left wins, yeah? This is challenging, right? And the problem is this relation has to be computed online, right? It's not a parallel processing, it's a serial processing. You have to actually focus on one side at a time, yeah? Okay, so this paradigm has been used extensively in perception research. It's called color conjunction. We know that if we give you guys ample time, you can do this. But performance suffers when we have this rapid presentation. And like what I did, there's a mask delay. We have those color patches to reduce the residual of your perceptual input. This will result to weaker representation of the relationship between the two parts, at least to poor behavior performance. Many adults, after experiencing several of these trials, they try to recruit language to help them, right? Like red is on the left, or something similar. And we know this because when we gave adults concurrent verbal tasks, their performance also suffered. So if we say at the very beginning of the trial, try to remember these 4 letters, and then we give you a task very similar to the one that I showed you before, show you 2 things in a particular spatial arrangement. There's a mask delay, and then I ask you to recall the spatial location, was this on top or at the bottom. Performance suffer when there's a concurrent verbal task. And the logic there is if I take away your linguistic trick, then your performance suffers, right? You can't do this task anymore, suggesting that people might spontaneously recruit language to solve the task. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
So was the checkerboard at the second part of the demo, was that the mask delay?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Any other questions? Good, okay. So how do young children do here? If you have young kids or you had young kids, you know how hard for them to figure out how to put on the right shoes. It literally takes years. Letter reversal writing, number reversal writing persists even to 1st and 2nd grade. So really, this is a very hard task for children to figure out. What helps them? What do you think we can help them? Language. Good answer. Language can help. So in a series of studies, researchers did use this paradigm I just showed you, give young children this figure, and there's a delay, and then ask them, which one did you see? So this one is the match. This one is the reflection. So you swap their position. This one is the different split. This is diagonal split, right? So this is their performance. If there's nothing, there's no language, only 66% of the time they choose the correct match. The errors are predominantly reflections, and then some of them also chose the different split. Those are 4-year-olds. If you give them a directional label during the encoding, if you show this and you say red is on the left, they do much better. 82.2% of the time, they chose the correct match. Okay, so there's some other demonstrations in the literature as well. So there's no doubt that language does help in spatial relational representation. What is under debate is how. Okay, so this, of course, fits squarely within the language and thought debate that some of you may have heard about, the Wolfram hypothesis, which emphasizes how language may transform the way that we process information in the world, versus the anti-Wolfram hypothesis, which really emphasizes universal similar patterns in the way that we process perceptual information that is maybe not easily changeable by the different language structure. The compromise, the consensus seems to be right now that language has an online effect on cognition. So language can change thought when it's actively used in the moment. So if I show you the figure, I tell you red is on the left, that helps. So it's unclear whether language has an effect later on when it's not present, right? Would you actually use language to solve the task? So for instance, in one keynote address by Barbara Landau in the Cognitive Science Society annual meetings in 2011, she framed this as a momentary interaction between language and space. So effective language on spatial representation is momentary. It's only in the online, in the moment. Another point she was making is the effect is also abstract, and that's what they mean. They did other manipulations in which they changed the part of this figure. They make the red part, for example, flashing, growing, pointing, sort of getting your attention to that part. The result is that those manipulations didn't improve performance. So their argument is that this shows language doesn't change cognition simply by changing attention. Okay, so that logic has always been weird to me because the null hypothesis we're trying to reject here is language change attention, then change relational representation. But that evidence I just showed you actually support this one, which is not using non-linguistic information. You draw attention by flashing a part, you change attention, but you don't improve relational representation. So it only proved that this part, it actually doesn't say the one on top. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So we designed a study to test that idea, very much like the demo that you guys see. We'll just give this to 4 years old. So in one of the conditions, they see this, they hear relational language, such as red is on the left or blue. In the control condition, we just give them generic instructions. So look at this one. Look at this carefully. There's a delay, and we ask them, which one did you see? And we track their eye movements this entire time. Using a stationary eye tracker, we put a lot of stickers on their forehead. Okay, we're clear on the procedures part? Yep, okay. All right, so another design feature of this study is we used a blocked design. So there are 2 phases in each of the condition. In the experimental condition, they first heard language during the first phase of the study. During the second phase, we take that relational language away. So we just say, look at this. So this would allow us to test whether hearing a language before would have effect on your future learning, even when language is no longer presented. Yep. And for the control condition, we simply swamped the order. So they would hear the non-relational language, just look at this, and then they will hear the relational language during the second phase. So the comparison between the experimental control group during the first phase will tell us the online effective language. Right? So when you're encoding the information, whether there's a language or no language, the comparison between the second phase of the experimental condition with the first phase of the control condition will allow us to say something about the sustained effective language. So if you have heard language before, even though right now you're not hearing language, does that change the way you process information from the world? Okay, is this logic clear? It's pretty important for interpreting the results. Okay, and that's exactly what we found. So we found both an online effect, so hearing a language in the moment help you to encode relational information better. It also help you to encode relational information later on, even when language was no longer presented. So this one suggests that it's not just in the moment, but also for future learning. Now, our second question is the mechanism about attention, right? And here we have a direct measure of attention. We measure their eye movements. And what I'm showing here is growth curve analysis results. So the x-axis is the time, y-axis is log adjusted proportional looking to different interest area. So the red is the target. So when you say red is on the left, red is the target. On the left, blue will be the foil. Okay, so what we see here for the online effect, there's no overlap. Right, so the learners prioritize the target side over the foil side. We also see same effect, although smaller for the sustained effect of attention, right? There's the differentiation between the 2 growth curves versus for the control group, they essentially overlap. Okay, so this data suggests that language improves learning by recruiting effective attention patterns. Okay, sure. So I think this idea of how systematic language leads to systematic attention actually reflects a general learning principle of system alignment. So one system aligned to the other one. And we can show this using non-linguistic system. We can show how systematic action also leads to systematic attention. And what we did is a perturbation study, which is a common approach when you study dynamic systems, right? The idea is you change some components in the system, you observe how the system behaves, right? To try to get to what is the organizing principle within this dynamic system. So we're interested in action and attention. We did this by having two sets of toys we give to two groups of children. One set is heavier than the other one, but perceptually they're identical. And we did that by putting sand in them. And we put them in this situation where the child and the parent play with this sets of toys together, where they wear dual mounted eye tracking on their head. So we can have the child egocentric view here and parents egocentric view here. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little clip. You can see on the left is the heavy condition. What is going on? That's not, okay, there we go. I have no idea whether this has to do with the network speed. Why is not playing? Okay. So you got a little glimpse of what the data look like. Yeah. I'll just jump in to tell you the pattern. So in the light condition, because the objects are light, so they can pick it up, they can rotate it, do whatever they want. In the heavy condition, it's too heavy. So they typically have it set on the table and they just poke it and in different ways, touch it and poke it in different ways. So the system dynamic of the hand action looks like this, right? For the light condition, you have the extended interaction, hand contact with the object. For the heavy condition, you have a short burst of contact, of pokes and touches. The question is, what would the attention system look like? What would the vision look like? So according to system alignment view, the two systems should be aligned. So the dynamic should mirror the dynamic of a hand contact, in which the light condition would have extended periods of interaction. The heavy condition will be in short bursts. According to a perception dominance attention hypothesis, which by the way is how attention is typically studied in cognitive psychology, is putting adults in front of a computer, give you some perceptual experiences, you know, look at different shapes on a computer screen. So very perception dominant attention sort of view. So according to this view, then attention should be driven by perception, right? If perceptually they're identical, then your attention should be identical between the two conditions. Does that make sense? Okay, which one do you think is the true pattern? System alignment, yeah. It is system alignment, but it's sort of an empirical question, right? You can see it play out either way, and our data strongly suggests it's the system alignment view. I'm not showing you the data because of time constraints, but my paper's all on the website. I'm happy to talk to you about the details. Okay, all right. Okay, so that's the first line of research where we talk about systematic language leads to systematic attention. Now we're going to jump to the second line of work in which we show the acquisition of a system of language can lead to acquisition of a system of conceptual knowledge. So for that, I'm going to transition from the domain of space to the domain of number, the domain of mathematics. So if I were to show this number to a 4-year-old, so he or she may say, oh, this is 232. For all of you guys here, you say, oh, this is 232. Yeah. Not only do you know that, you also can decompose it to its individual parts, right? With it's made up 230 and 2. 200 is further decomposable to 2 sets of 100, 30 to 3 sets of 10s, and so on and so forth. So this number names carry syntactical structures here, right? The word 100, the suffix ty, are all syntactical, it's all relational, right? So hundreds cannot exist in isolation without the decades, without the units. So it has very similar to the grammatical structures, the way that I see it, because the place value is tied into the position, the order of the elements within the utterance. So what's special about number words is it's also tied to algebraic relations, right? Which is a foundational to mathematics in general. One surprising but really robust finding that me and my colleagues has been finding in our labs is that many young children have early knowledge of this system. So you can give them a task like this one, you show them 36 and 306, and you ask which one is 36. They can, above chance, pretty reliably tell you which one is 36. Started from age 3, and of course, this incrementally increase as they grow older. Okay, and not only do they have this early knowledge, it's also highly correlated to their later mathematical learning. So we did a 3-year longitudinal study. We measured this kind of early knowledge at kindergarten, and we followed them 2 years, first grade and second grade. And they're showing part of this data to you. This is one of the strongest correlation I've ever seen in my career. Is very predictable to their later learning. So this introduced 2 outstanding questions. The first one is, how did they learn this in the first place, where no one is teaching them? You know, those are preschool, 3 to 5 years old. No one is teaching them the meaning of 100 or decades. Second question is, what does this knowledge do for future learning? We already see a strong predictor relation, but what is the mechanism? So I'm going to try to show you some data to answer both questions. So when children learn number words, it's almost like they're learning vocabulary and syntax at the same time, right? They need to master the names for individual digits. They also need to master the place value words. And they also not just learning one regularities like the past tense. They're learning multiple regularities at the same time, right? Of course, language is really hard to show. It's very complex. You have the plural form, you have the past tense, it's all kind of overlapped together. Number words is a very trackable domain. We can study this. And just to say that we started with the number words, but grad students in the lab, Lucy, now is extending this to the learning of artificial language, try to directly test how might those learning emerge in language systems in general. Okay, going back to this. There are 2 premises. The first one is, although it looks like a very structured representation, but those are latent structures. Those are not taught to the learners. Those are not innately specified, right? So they have to learn and build these structures internally through sort of like a hodgepodge of correlations. And here's my toy representation of that, what that looks like, okay? So the input data that learners receive in their environment is probably just pairs of written numbers and number words. Maybe in the elevator, right? We're going to the 11th floor. Maybe in the supermarket where they're buying stuff, right? How much does this cost? So what learners might be noticing is correlations, right? So the 3 in 37 looks like the 3 in 535. 7 looks like 7. 6 to 6, the 30 and 60 share the same components ty, and just so on and so forth, right? So you got a hodgepodge of correlations. So this is our hypothesis, the mechanism. So can we show this in real data? So we use corpus data analysis methods here because we happen to have multiple different projects. They all are designed for different purposes, but they have one common feature, which is they use the widgets and task I just showed you. So you show them 2 written numbers, you ask one by name. So we just put them together, and this resulted in a corpus of 403 children aged 5 to 7 years old, and they contribute together to over 6,000 trials. And this gave us enough data where we can start to look at the developmental patterns. So the first thing we did is we calculated the average scores for each individual child, and then we put them in 4 quartiles, depending on their performance. And we use that as an index of their kind of developmental stage. And what you see here is largely overlap, right? We have 3-year-olds performing at quartile 4. And then we have 6, 7 years old at the cusp of school entry perform really poorly at quartile 1. Okay, so huge individual difference, and age is not a good predictor. Even though if you look at age as a group, you will see incremental growth. You can see that from the peak of the distribution. Okay, next thing we did is, this is all of the trials that we have. We coded each of the items along 6 non-mutually exclusive features. So for each of the item, we ask whether the maximum number of digits is 2 or under, whether it's 3 or under, 4 or under. We ask whether the 2 choices have the same length, whether there's a 0, whether there's a transposition. So 14 and 41 will be a transposition item. All of those factors have been indicated in previous developmental work as important for young children's understanding of multi-digit numbers. Okay, so our goal here is to use decision trees to figure out whether there's any systematic patterns in their judgment. Okay, if there's no pattern, we won't find anything. Okay, all right, so this is what we found from quartile 1 to quartile 4. On the left, I'm showing the final trees. As you can see, it become increasingly sophisticated, right? So initially, the only distinguishing factor is whether there's a 0. And then we're putting more features. They're sensitive to different features. Even more sophisticated until quartile 4 is less because they 99% accuracy. So you just like have the perfect and almost perfect group. Okay, on the right is the rank order of accuracy for individual items. I just want to draw your attention by zooming into some specific patterns here. At quartile 3, this is when they started to be able to tell apart the decades and 100 numbers. Okay, so items like 67 versus 670. What I'm trying to show here is, if this is clean rule learning, if all you need to know is to tell apart decades and 100 is 100 have 3 digits, decades have 2, the digits different. You would have succeeded on all of these trials pretty much at the same time, right? Like what you have seen here, though, is a graded representation. You succeed on some of those trials, and in other trials that are structurally very similar, 42 versus 402, you don't succeed, and so on and so forth. Okay, so it's not a clear rule learning, is more like a graded, gradual accumulation of statistical patterns until it press a threshold, and then you can succeed at all of those trials. Okay.
So that order on the bottom there, even on the trials.
So each children only get one of those items, and they didn't get all of them. So they get probably 12 items on average, some maybe like 10 to 10, others like 14. With children, you can't give them too many trials. So they're not repeated within person, but they're repeated between people. Yeah, so this is average. You can interpret the y-axis as the percentage of children who can answer that item correctly. Okay, any other questions? Okay, all right. Let's see. So we also did a network analysis, graph theory, to try to summarize the pattern of the results here. So what I'm showing here is for each of the trial, we got 2 numbers. We categorize each numbers into 4 different categories, whether it's a single digit number, double digit, 100, or 1,000. And then the edges represents a average accuracy, basically. What you see is, rather than start with one comparison and completely master it, is much graded, right? So you start somewhere, you grow into the peripheries to the next ranges, and in some cases, they're outpost, like the thousands. They started to kind of figure out something about the thousands, and then later integrate that into the whole system. So this is from quartile 1 to quartile 2, quartile 3 to quartile 4. So the way we interpret this is that it started with bits and pieces knowledge, and then gradually it got coalesced into a coherent system. Questions? Okay, so now let's try to answer our second question. What does it do for future learning given the strong predictive power? As I mentioned before, we did a 3-year longitudinal study. We gave them, tasks that measure early understanding, such as what we call this read and write task. So what is this number? Write 243. So this is meant to capture their early knowledge of the symbol system itself. And the other task is more conceptual. You could say that's the meaning of the symbols, right? So which number represents more? Ugh. Where does this number go on the number line? Count how many small squares are there. So we're looking for whether they count by base 10, right? So 100, 110, 120, and so on, rather than by ones. This one is whether you can decompose a number into individual components. This one is asking the meaning of specific place value terms. Okay, anyway, so we did a bunch of factor analyses, but what I think was really interesting is this one using network analyses, and this one is using partial correlation networks. So what it means is the edges here represents a partial correlation between the two tasks after controlling their correlations with all the other tasks. Okay, so what we see here is this RW is the read and write. That is early symbol knowledge. B10 is a base 10 counting, so counting objects by groups of tens. Now, when you think about that one also involves understanding the symbol system. You have to be able to count, right? They're at the hub. That's the kindergarten. At first grade, they're still as the hub, right? And the whole network have sort of become more strongly connected, stronger edges. But the hub, being the hub, the way I think about it is almost like the information highway. You get on it, you might be able to develop capacities that connect you to the other tasks. Okay, I'm gonna skip this. We did a training study to train on those skills, and it did seem to improve. So all of this evidence suggesting that acquiring the language system is actually really important as a stepping stone to acquiring the mathematical concepts of place value. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to try to put this all together to show you how we can use deep learning models to show systematic language leads to systematic knowledge via changing attention. So our starting point is to first with children to see whether this kind of exposure-based statistical learning can indeed lead to the acquisition of early number knowledge. So we did a training study where we exposed children to multi-digit numbers and their read-in forms through implicit casual activities, and this is picture book reading. So we'll be like reading this picture books with them. Johnny wants to save money to buy his favorite toys and food. He wants to buy a cake. How much does it cost? This costs $40. So just exposure, right? In a fun, kind of engaging way. That's the training condition. For the control, they experience exactly the same picture book reading with experimenter, except it's not about numbers, it's about spelling. So how do you spell cake, bike, and so on. We have some training numbers. It's very sparse, only 36 numbers in 3 days, about 10 minutes per day. So not a lot of exposure. Testing numbers, half of them already experienced during training. So that's just testing whether they remembered it. And the other testing numbers they never experienced. So those are testing generalization. Can they learn something about the syntactical structure of the system and generalize to new instances? Now, to select the deep learning models, we opted for an image captioning model because we think it captures the learning processes of the children very well. Because for the children, they saw an image, they were told the names, right? So with the image caption model, we use a CNN to extract visual patterns, and then a LSTM model to provide the number names, the tokens coming in at different times. So very similar to the way that humans might be reading visual input. Yeah. And then this one has attention pattern. So to sort of facilitate the mapping between the linguistic input and different components of visual input. Okay. So a lot of, gloss over a lot of details. I'll just tell you the basic results. We use different ways to measure the model, as the way you evaluate image caption models is not always straightforward. We have 4 different measurements, but basically we show that the model learned after training. It also shows signature error patterns like children. So there are different items. Some are more difficult than others. We look at the model's performance. It shows the same sort of order as young children. Okay. Since we have attention, we can look at the attention map, and indeed the model seems to be learning the structural alignment between the number names with regions in the image. And this prompts us to generate the hypothesis, maybe what this early knowledge doing is really to direct the learner's attention to the correct component of the referred number. And when you think about classroom instruction, this is actually very important. And that might be the mechanism underlying this strong correlation. So in the classroom, we often expose the learners to many different input, right? So in a typical first grade mathematics classroom where they're trying to learn place value systems, they might have number cards, physical models. This is based in blocks. They're trying to build based in blocks of a particular numerosity. There might be other symbol system there. So whether the learner can effectively follow the teacher's instruction to pay attention to the right component may be very important. And the difference may be small, at each instance, maybe like 100 millisecond delay if you have the knowledge or not. But over time, this can create a large individual difference, right? So I've been collecting data, putting head-mounted eye trackers on children and give them kind of instructions that we modeled after school teaching to try to see whether early implicit number knowledge indeed could be a mediator in how well they can learn from formal school instruction. Sort of answering this question of how could everyone receiving the same instruction from the same teacher in the same classroom, but ended up with vastly different learning outcomes. Okay, so just quickly mention 2 other projects that inspired by this deep learning models. So one of them, this is done by Lily Zhu, a master's degree student in data science from Johns Hopkins, who've been working with us for the past 2 years. Lily is interested in a very robust finding in cognitive development, and that is cross-cultural differences, cross-nation differences in number learning and mathematical outcomes. So we know that children from, for example, Eastern Asian culture tend to outperform their counterparts in America in many different mathematics and number-related tasks, even early on. Different theories have been proposed, and one of them being because their language symbol system, the number names, is more transparent, is more systematic. So here I'm showing the English number names and the Chinese correspondence, right? So 11 in Chinese is 11, and it's directly translated to 10 yuan. 13 is 13, 10.3, 20 is 210. So it's a very sort of direct translation of the base 10 relations. Yeah, okay. So you can't make that conclusion because there's a huge confound here, culture. The difference between American and say Chinese children is not only in their language input, but also in their culture values, right? We know that Eastern culture, a lot of them put a lot of emphasis on educational academic success, right? So what we're trying to do in this project is to use models to see whether computationally there's advantage for certain language symbol system compared to others. So get rid of the cultural confound. So Lily basically used the same image captioning model. We are extending that to transformer models, but this is what we got now. So basically we're seeing the more systematic language outperform the less systematic language. So if you know anything about French, there's a lot of idiosyncratic patterns, right? The way that you say 80 is 420 or 240, 420. Oh yeah. So it's probably the least systematic within these 4 comparisons versus Chinese is most systematic, followed by Turkish, English, and French. So what we see here is computationally, the learning outcome follows exactly the same order. She is looking at other interesting things. One of them is she called the creativity measure. So she basically measures when the models get something wrong, what strategy does this model take? Does this model just recall what it's been trained on? Or does it make an attempt to combine different components in new ways? Okay. So she'll find how far is the response label from the closest number name in the training data. So higher value means so the higher value here showing the Chinese just means the model are more likely to create new combinations. Okay. All right, so 2 minutes. The last project I will talk about in which we use language-based, language-aided deep reinforcement learning models to really try to model this process of classroom learning where you have visual input, you have linguistic input, you have learners' actions, and you have feedback from the teacher. You got it right or wrong. This is collaboration with master students in the CS department, Metro. He's graduating, yeah, this December. So we're trying to wrap everything up. I'm going to just show you some of the results here since this is still ongoing. This is a reinforcement learning environment. Might be a little bit hard to see here, but we just created artificial environment where we kind of mimic the different place value blocks. Here we're using like color as indication rather than size. There is a number cards. I'm sorry, it's flipped. No, this is, and then the learner, the agent is asked to learn how to build this number using the different blocks. And we have two kinds of instruction. One is the policy-based, which is more like, do this, take 5 of the 10 blocks and put it here. Another one is more state-based, so explanation. So you just did this, and remember this is number you're trying to make. Okay, what I'm showing the results is going to be a policy-based reinforcement learning model. Okay, so we had 3 different models here. The CNN-only model, we're just using a ResNet to process the image, right? It's the whole episode, so lots of images. In the CNN plus NLP model, so we use ResNet to process the visual input, and we use the BERT to process the language. They're concatenated and put it into a reinforcement learning model. And then Metro wanted to try just NLP without vision, which is almost like a LSA. Like how much can you learn from the language itself without even vision? The results is actually quite interesting. So this is during the training. The CNN only did really poorly. It doesn't converge. The CNN plus NLP did well. This is the simple NLP. It takes longer, but it still converged. There's a lot of information, you know, kind of reinforcing this idea that you can get from language model itself. Okay. So this is for the training and testing. I'm sorry, this thing kind of blocked the top. This is the training for single digits. They got trained on 2, 3, 6, 7, 8. We're looking at their training performance, all the same. They got tested on generalization, 1, 4, 5, 9, which they have never seen during the training. All very good. This is single digit number. When it's simple, all the models succeed. When it's multi-digit, we see a different pattern. On top is the training, bottom is testing. And you can see we test generalization because those number ranges, they have never seen anything like that. The green, which is CNN plus NLP, outperform all the other models, basically. You see the GPT model is the new model that we're doing. So not only have the vision and the instruction, but also give it attention, right? So whether you can figure out the correspondence between vision and the instruction. Okay, so I do not think any of this model like capture the entirety of learning, which is quite complicated. The way that I think about it is almost like a mouse models of human cognition, just like the way that we still use mouse models to study biology, for example. All models are wrong, some are useful, right? So that's kind of going back to the old adage. I think the value here is really, it can inform us about the computational principles of human learning, and tell us things like how to structure training data to maximize learning, right? You can design studies to test different ways. You can arrange your training input to see which one is the most effective. It can help us to model learning trajectories for groups or individuals, figure out contextual and individual variabilities in the environment or the internal structure, and how is it related to learning? Okay, what happened? Here we go. And I think the other side is also true, AI, building better human-like artificial intelligence. We can learn a lot from human cognition as well, right? So for instance, humans can have this view invariant representation of objects. There's some models proposed, rather than just a CNN model, you can use video input, try to capture the different viewpoint to help a model do better at object classification. Yeah, there's a emerging field of developmental robotics, also trying to combine the software and the hardware, and think about learning trajectories from young children and how the learning input, the structure of learning input is related to the learning outcome, not just the algorithm itself. Yeah. Okay, so my time is up. That's the 3 areas of research I've showed you. And I think together they support a more sort of system alignment view of human cognition, of how cognition and intelligence can arise from alignment between the different, for example, language, perception, action, social interaction systems, with attention play a very important role in this process. Okay, so thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
I thank you for your talk. I think this question would help me understand systematic attention. So in the red-blue experiment, is the language, is that anchoring the memory of a specific symbol, or is it signifying to the subject the importance of the difference between left and right?
Okay, so first of all, they don't understand left and right at this age. So they cannot tell you if you put something here, right? You put a ducky on the left and ducky on the right. You say, give me the ducky that is on the left. They can't do that task, not consistently. What I think it does is they know left and right denote spatial relations. So their attention is drawn to encode the spatial relations more so than, say, feature information. So it's not just, there's a red, there's a blue. So the red is in a particular location, I'm going to encode that location. Yeah, so it's kind of both, right? I think that's how they learn the meaning of left as well. I mean, like, how would you learn it beyond you actually can link the symbol with the location and do it repeatedly? Mm-hmm.
Another thing for talk. I have one general question. So if you go back to the slide that just showed the systematic language, action, sorry, attention, and
This one?
yeah. So it's a very general question. So when I saw this, I was just keeping asking myself, so how is, for example, like how is, I mean, your shows like, systematic language, maybe it's kind of different from simplified language, but I'm thinking like, what about systematic attention? What about systematic knowledge? How do they differ from simplified attention and knowledge? Because systematic language, you have shows like, Chinese, French, Turkish, maybe Chinese, maybe it's like in terms of number systems, more systematic than our languages. But I just wonder like how systematic attention is different from attention, knowledge is different from knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So what I think what language does is, say you're in a particular language community and your community prioritizes this information in this particular order, right? That might change the way you process information. right? And habitual use of this pairing between language with a particular pattern of attention got reinforced day in and day out. Eventually, then language is not present, right? You don't have to use language for solving all of the tasks. However, the attention pattern is already there. It's actually could be quite robust, right? Because that's the laws of statistical learning. Then that might influence the way that you interpret new information in the environment, the way that you answer questions, for example. I think they're all kind of linked together to a large degree, and that's sort of the system alignment view. That's what we're trying to showcase here. Mm-hmm.
Question. So in experiments like the item price experiment, are gestures used or are those withheld?
Which one?
The item price experiment, like the cake is $40, stuff like that. Is the trainer using gestures or are they supposed to not use any gestures?
Really good question. Yeah. So in that particular study, they did use gesture, just like when you read a book, right? 40, you kind of point to the individual components, and you could say that's really helping them to discover the mapping, right? As teachers in a real classroom and just parents in general, you don't always have that chance, right? You can't go around and point out, this is important information, that's important. So it's really important for them to build a strong internally guided attention, right? And the way that, particularly in the context of this domain, we think it's really knowing the number of names, right? Knowing where to pay attention to going to play a big role in real classroom learning when your teacher can't point everything for you, whether you already have internal guided attention. When I hear 255, how many hundreds does it have? I can quickly go to that digits. That might be the underlying mechanism of why some children fare better than others.
So is there a way of presenting, the order of examples to develop that internal attention direction?
Yes. So in an ongoing study, we tried to use like linguistic ways to get attention and non-linguistic ways to get attention. Yep. I think it's an empirical question to see which one will lead to a stronger and more enduring knowledge representation, right? So you can short circuit this to say, this is where you should pay attention to, or you can sort of give learner many statistical regularities for them to discover those latent structure. So I think it's a really interesting empirical question to see like which one is more inducive for learning in the long run. Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. I don't know if anyone over Zoom have questions. I can't see. No. Go ahead.
So, okay, another question. In this slide, should I take those like ages, like directions seriously? And for example, like we have seen like how the systematic like language helps us forms attention, knowledge. And my question is, would it be possible to go vice versa? For example, like, would it be possible that systematic knowledge can like help language, and are you aware of any other like research skill?
Mm-hmm. I think that's what the mimicking the classroom environment is trying to get at. So if you have early knowledge, which is you have systematic knowledge, that would change your attention, and then it will help you either hinder or help you to learn the new mathematical algebraic relations. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I'm just curious, like if systematic attention is sort of indicative of future performance in that, is that, I guess, is it a trainable quality? Is it something that needs to be practiced in general? And other things with subjects, like if a kid is like innately really good at or is practiced good systematic attention in the classroom, are they also going to exhibit those traits of learning like language or history or something else? Or
Mhm.
is there variance?
Yeah. So there are two pieces of evidence. One is we see this large individual differences, right? It's not quite related to age. It's also not related to SES. We didn't measure. We have proximate measures of socioeconomic classes, and that's actually a good thing. It's not related to that. Second piece of evidence is from the training study with only 36 numbers and 10 minutes per day for 3 days. You already see this very significant improvement. So I do think it's quite teachable. It's quite trainable. Yeah. In terms of like innate individual differences, there might be general attention, just like how much you can pay attention. But then in terms of this domain, we know that mathematics is a late invention in human history, right? I would doubt like it has innate basis for understanding something like 200 is more than 100, like different culture also have a different systems in which they organize this information. So yeah, that's my response to the question. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for all of the questions. Yeah. Great discussion.